Could God be evil? Not unless we want to radically redefine what we mean by God. You see, I've heard this objection a lot since I started making videos on this channel arguing for the existence of God. People say, look, Thomas, you always say that God is all good, but couldn't God just as easily be evil, or even all evil? I mean, what reason do we have to assume that the world was created by an all-good God and not an all-evil God? And if the two possibilities are just as likely, why presuppose one over the other? And this is a good question, so I want to make sure I address it. And I think the basic answer has to come down to what we mean when we talk about God. You see, the most important thing we have to do at the start of any kind of conversation is figure out if we're talking about the same thing. We have to define our terms. I mean, imagine if you and I wanted to have a conversation about whether or not football is a good sport. I would have to first make sure that you're not British, because I'm American. And when I think football, I think real football. I think guys in pads tackling each other in order to score touchdowns. But if you're not from here, you might think that other thing that they play in other parts of the world where they don't touch the ball and they never actually score, that game. I would have to make sure at the start of the conversation that we are talking about the same sport. Because otherwise, we would just end up having two totally different conversations at each other. You would think we're talking about one thing, I would think we're talking about the other, we would talk past each other. In the same way, if we're going to have a conversation about what God is like, and if God could have a certain attribute, like being evil, we have to figure out what we mean by God. So here I'm going to propose a definition of God. It's one that has significant philosophical and historical precedence. It is this notion of God that has been defended and argued for by philosophers for 2,500 years. This definition of God goes at least as far back to Aristotle. That's how old it is. And the basic definition is that God is existence itself. And there's other ways to say this too. We could say that God is infinite existence, or that God is an infinite being, or that God has maximally great being, or that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, or that he's pure actuality. These are all different philosophers' ways at getting at the same idea, that God is a being whose very nature, his very what it is to be him, is existence. In the same way that you and I go outside and look at a woody thing over there and say, what is that? And we say, well, it has a trunk, it's got leaves, it's a tree. That's its nature. We would look at God and say, what is that? It is to be. That is his very nature. And to those Catholics or other Christians out there who might be saying to themselves right now, look, this Thomas, this sounds a little kind of weird and new agey. Are you sure this is really Christian? Yeah. This idea is 100% compatible with the thought of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. It's been adopted historically by the philosophies of all three religions. And Thomas Aquinas even argued that this definition of God was used by God himself in the book of Exodus when he says to Moses, I am who am. That he's saying in that passage that his very nature, his very what it is to be God, is to be. I am who am. I am who is. That is my nature. To be. So there's a lot of precedence for this definition. It's the one that I've been defending on this channel. If you want to go and defend some other thing that you want to call God and attribute to it different attributes other than being existence itself, fine by me, but just understand that when we have a conversation about God, we won't be talking about the same thing. So we would have to figure out which being we're talking about. So when I'm talking about God, I'm talking about existence itself. Okay, how does this relate to the idea that God is all good necessarily and can't have any evil in him? Well, I want to introduce another notion from classical philosophy here. This is called the doctrine of the transcendentals. And basically what this means, it's a big word, transcendentals, for what I hope will be a simple concept, which is that being or existence and goodness are interrelated concepts. In fact, they're almost synonymous. Basically, they refer to the same thing. When I say that thing is good, I'm saying the same thing as that thing has a lot of being as the kind of thing it is. It very much shows an example of the kind of thing it is, the kind of nature it has in fullness. In the same way that we might say that Batman and Bruce Wayne look at the same concept under the same person under a different light, you know, one is his superhero identity and one is his secret identity, we could say that being and goodness look at the same quality of a thing under different light. being looks at just as being. Goodness looks at it as being with the notion of being desirable to us, to fulfill our nature. Being and being more, as one of my philosophy professors once put it. And we can kind of see this when we try to think of examples, intuitively. I mean, if I wanted to draw a triangle right here, I would want it to have 3 perfect sides. Why? Because then it would most express what it means to be a triangle, if it has 3 perfect sides. It would be a good triangle, because it most expresses the nature of a triangle. If I wanted to be, under this definition of goodness, a good man, I would have to most fulfill what it is to be a man, what it is to be a rational animal. So I would want to live most in accordance with my nature as a rational animal. And this has been traditionally what's been understood as natural law moral theory. This idea that doing good is about fulfilling your nature. And it's because of that idea of natural law moral theory that I would caution someone who wants to reject this notion of goodness and being interchangeable. Because the modern world did reject this notion. But 500 years ago, there was a revolution in philosophy where, without really arguing for it and instead just kind of inserting it, they denied the doctrine of the transcendentals. They just kind of asserted that the doctrine of the transcendentals was false and that being and goodness aren't interchangeable. A couple hundred years down the line, you ended up with what's known as Hume's is-ought dilemma. David Hume argued that it is a fallacy to proceed from talking about the way the world is to the way the world ought to be. What this means practically is that he's saying it's a mistake in reasoning if you are going to proceed from discussions about a thing's nature and try to ground your idea of right and wrong on that. I can't proceed, he's saying, from discussions about the way a man is to the way a man ought to act. I can't say, for example, man is a non-murdering kind of thing, therefore he ought not to murder, because he's the kind of creature which ought not to be a murderer, that's unbecoming of his nature. And that's the kind of moral reasoning we do intuitively. But we have to reject that kind of moral analysis under Hume's understanding of the is-ought problem if goodness and being aren't interconnected. If is and ought are really not interconnected. The only way to save morality from the is-ought problem is to deny that is and ought are really distinct concepts and to say they are interconnected concepts, like the philosophical world has done for thousands of years before, I think, the 1600s. And I'll definitely be getting into this more in future videos. It's been something I've been thinking a lot lately. But first I want to show you why this important doctrine of the transcendentals is important for our conversation about whether or not God could possibly be evil. And you might already be seeing this. After all, if God is existence itself, if God's very nature, his very what it is to be him, is to be its existence, and to be is the same thing as to be good because of the doctrine of the transcendentals, then God's very nature, in addition to being to be, is also to be good. So in addition to being existence itself, God is also goodness itself. And that means he's the ultimate example, pure goodness. He's the ultimate example of goodness. So God, to speak of God being evil, is just as absurd as to speak of God lacking some kind of being. Because he is existence himself, he's goodness himself. Those two concepts are connected. So, God cannot be evil. To speak of an all-evil God is like speaking about a square that has less than 4 sides. It's a logical possibility. And that would be my answer to the question raised at the beginning of this video. No, God cannot be evil as long as you understand what we mean by God. And if you want more answers like that in the future, I highly recommend you subscribe to this channel and please consider liking this video. God bless. Thank you.